And I just wonder if you worry that Ukraine will be left in the back of the shelf the more focus we put on Iran.
Well, frankly, Ukraine has been put on a back shelf since Donald Trump came into the White House, because I think there's absolutely no doubt that the current president of the United States, however crazily that sounds, is actually on the side of Vladimir Putin. He's generally on the side of dictatorships against democracies, and that's clearly the case also in the war.
He says he's been harder on Putin than any president in history.
Yeah, well, I think, I'm a historian, and we historians usually go by the facts, not by what people say. I think it's absolutely clear that in the war that Russian dictator and usurper Vladimir Putin has unleashed against Ukraine, the sympathies of the current U.S. administration are clearly with Putin.
Help us understand this relationship between President Trump and President Putin. Some say, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. Is it possible that this is strategy on the part of President Trump to pretend that there is friendships, or how do you see this relationship, what it really means? Because there are times he has pushed back, certainly, at the Russian president.
I'm not a psychologist, but in my view...
but you understand Russia.
Yeah.
You've been in prison. You've had to deal with what is the reality of what goes on in Russia and what is
I think Donald Trump just likes Vladimir Putin, and this is the root of the problem. I mean, we hear all these conspiracy theories about some potential compromise or whatever that Russian security services may have on Mr. Trump. One day, once the Putin regime is gone and the archives are open in Russia, in a future democratic Russia, we may find this out. Obviously, I don't have any inside information on this, but I just think that the main problem is that Trump likes Putin. He likes autocrats. He likes so-called strongmen. That word, by the way, is deeply misleading. There's nothing strong about imprisoning or killing your opponents, about falsifying elections, about muzzling the media. That's actually the behavior of somebody who is weak and insecure, which is what Vladimir Putin is. But Trump likes dictators. I mean, I think he would like to have no parliament, no elections, no media. Of course, the situation is very different in Russia and in America. When Vladimir Putin came to power, Russia only had 10 years of democracy behind it. And so it took him only a few years to destroy our democratic institutions, the separation of powers, free elections, independent media, and so on. You in the U.S. This year are marking the 250th anniversary of your democracy. So, of course, the situation and the context are very different. But if we're talking about personalities, I think they're just fundamentally alike, and this is the problem.
Well, our audience should know that you have personally felt the wrath of Vladimir Putin, and having been poisoned not once but twice, yet you're sitting here with us today. There's news this week that Vladimir Putin is receiving additional security, that they're beefing up security around the president because of the number of threats against him. Is that justified? And what are you hearing about the opposition in Russia?
First of all, if I could argue with the terminology, let's not call him president. He's not a president. He's a dictator and a usurper. Presidents don't stay in power for 26 years, which is how long he's been in power. And we haven't had a free election in Russia for more than 2 decades. This is not my opinion. This is the verdict of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is the gold standard for election observation. But yeah, I mean, it's clear that Putin is paranoid. He's spending most of the time in the bunkers. There are anti-missile systems around his, his residences. We hear about additional security, of course, in the coming days. There will be a Victory Day parade on Red Square, which is going to be massively scaled down because Putin is afraid, he's afraid of Ukrainian drones, he's afraid of a potential coup, he's afraid of attempts on his life, he's afraid of everything. I mean, this is what happens when you cling to power for more than 2 decades with no elections, with no independent media, with no normal political system. This is how all these dictators end up.
Is there an
paranoid in their bunker? Well, first of all, frankly, I wish that Vladimir Putin spends as much time in prison as possible. I want to see him in the dock on trial for all the crimes, being held accountable for all the crimes he has committed against our own people in Russia. Let's not forget the 2 main opposition leaders in Russia, Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, have been murdered on Vladimir Putin's personal orders. There are thousands of political prisoners in our country, more than 2,000 known political prisoners, according to human rights groups. This is more than the whole of the Soviet Union, that's 15 countries put together, had in the mid-1980s. And, of course, for the 5th year now, and really for the 13th year now, because the annexation of Crimea happened back in March of 2014. Vladimir Putin has been leading the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. I want him to be held accountable for this.
I want to understand something in how you see President Trump, because he can remove dictators. Look at what happened with Maduro in Venezuela. Look at what's happening in Iran. Like, there are times he does push back against dictators. So I just wonder, what is the special mix here between these 2 individuals? And do you start to also think about, nobody lives forever. Do you think about life, without Putin, and then what happens in Russia?
It's not just that we think about it, we have to think about it, we have to plan for it, and not just we,
but is it being
the Russian
planned
opposition. Yes, it is, and in fact our organization, the Free Russia Foundation, and other groups like Memorial and Yulia Navalnya's Forum are actively working on a roadmap for a post-Putin transition in Russia. We're also doing this on the international level. I'm a member of the Platform for Dialogue with Russian Democratic Forces at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which brings together lawmakers from 46 European countries.
Yeah.
Look, Russian history teaches us that major political changes in our country happen like this, swiftly, suddenly, and totally unexpectedly. Both the Tsarist regime and the communist regime collapsed in 3 days, literally speaking. Nobody saw it coming. Whenever the Putin regime falls, it will be just as sudden and just as unexpected. And we have no right to be unprepared for that because Russia is too important.
Anytime soon?
Could be in 3 years and could be in 2 weeks. This is Russia. But the point is we have to be ready because Russia matters. Russia is too important. And for as long as there's a dictatorial regime in Russia, Russia will continue to remain a threat not just to its own people, our own people, but also to everybody around. And the only way to have long-term peace and security in Europe is with a democratic Russia, a reliably democratic Russia that will respect the rights and freedoms of its own people and that will respect the borders of its neighbors. And we have to work towards that post-Putin democratic Russia together.